Ow, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House Post Totem Pole Addressing Indigenous Specific Systemic Racism with Ancestral Knowledge and Matriarchal Wisdom. By Tracy Underwood. B.A., University of Victoria, 2001 M.A., University of Victoria, 2010. A dissertation submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in the School of Child and Youth Care. Copyright Tracy Underwood, 2024 University of Victoria. All rights reserved. This dissertation may not be reproduced in whole or in part, by photocopy or other means, without the permission of the author. As a W'Sunek matriarch, I welcome you to the territory of the land of my Lekwungen and W'Sunek ancestors. I hold in high regard my Lekwungen scales, as before contact we were not separated on small sections of our island. We all lived together. Every day I have matriarchal duties to protect our children, land, culture and language. Every day I pray that my people are upheld, understood and respected for their resiliency, strength and courage facing the day-to-day colonial impacts that continue to be inflicted on us. All my relations, HISF KSI, IEM. Ow, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House Post Totem Pole Addressing Indigenous Specific Systemic Racism with Ancestral Knowledge and Matriarchal Wisdom. By Tracy Underwood. B.A., University of Victoria, 2001 M.A., University of Victoria, 2010. Supervisory Committee. Dr. Sarah Wright Cardinal, Supervisor School of Public Health and Social Policy. Dr. Sandrina Kerrer, Departmental, Member School of Child and Youth Care. Dr. Billy Allen, External Member School of Social Work. IV. Abstract. My doctoral project, Ow, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House Post Totem Pole Addressing Indigenous Specific Systemic Racism with Ancestral Knowledge and Matriarchal Wisdom, consists of an Indigenous healing framework which finds expression in the raised form of a WSANIC healing house post totem. My overall research question is, how do Kenala, Sani W'Sunek heal from systemic anti-Indigenous racism? Ow, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House Post responds both conceptually and practically to the ongoing damage inflicted on our peoples through prejudice, dehumanization, and systemic racism, all too familiar to survivors of colonization. The house post is comprised of 4 sections: Kelolmasen Orca Whale, Life Before Europeans, Spa at Bear, To Give and Receive Acknowledgement, Wex's Frogs, Reconstruction Within Canadian Systems, Persistent Dehumanizing Trauma Theory, Response Theory, and Kellenson Eagle, Healing Vision. Each section has stories that frame my epistemology embedded with my matriarchal roots in WSANIC. All are connected to the Kellenson Healing V-Zone of Eagle at the top of the house post, which will speak healing pathways in response to the anti-Indigenous racism in the systems we live and work within that were not created for us. The Healing House Post transitions from theory to practice through its material representation of both decolonizing resistance and culturally specific WSANIC pathways to healing. The result is storytelling from my matriarchal teachings, which came from traditional ways of knowing and being that are the reasons why we are still here. It does this by addressing Indigenous-specific systemic racism with ancestral knowledge and Kenala, Sani matriarch teachings that speak to matriarchal wisdom derived from my advocacy for and protection of my children, family, and community members. Summary. My doctoral project, Ow, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House Post Totem Pole Addressing Indigenous-Specific Systemic Racism with Ancestral Knowledge and Matriarchal Wisdom, consists of an Indigenous healing framework which finds expression in the raised form of a WSANIC healing house pole totem. Ow, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House Post is similar to what many know as a totem pole but is at the front of our Coast Salish homes in the past. This house post is comprised of 4 sections: whale, bear, frog and eagle. Each section has stories that frame my epistemology embedded with my matriarchal roots in WSANIC. My PhD journey is created as pathways of healing written to help my people with the day-to-day harms inflicted since the arrival of settler colonialism. Throughout my writing I have kept my children and grandchildren in mind, and they can use my work as a method of recalling some of our ways. My experience of recent and ongoing direct systemic harm, and challenging the system and writing about it, has shaped this house post. My overall research question is, how do Kenula, et Sani W. Sinek heal from systemic anti-Indigenous racism? To address this question, my Healing House post transitions from theory to actual practice through its material representation of both decolonizing resistance and culturally specific WSANic pathways to healing and storytelling from my matriarchal teachings. My dissertation begins with W. Sinek ne Aleninek or self-location. The purpose of this is to situate myself within my family, recognizing both our strength and the colonial experience we are healing from, the cultural genocide aimed at getting rid of us through such strategies as the residential and church-run school systems, loss of language, loss of culture and loss of land in addition to ongoing Indigenous-specific systemic racism. Au, Nanat v. Sextkeen embodies a healing framework, resulting in pathways and strategies to help W. Sinek recover from systemic harms. To this day, the destructive tools of colonization remain embedded in the systems we navigate in daily life. These include the health care, education, children and family services, and justice systems because all of these are based upon colonial policies and procedures that don't normally account for Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Instead, they often end up inflicting harmful trauma on my people through the delivery of their services that stem from their policies and procedures. Au, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House post is the practical expression of my conceptual framework. To this end, it includes 4 sections, each with its own stories and teachings: Kelolmasen Orca Whale, Life Before Europeans, Spa at Bear, Janonet, To Give and Receive Acknowledgement, Wex's Frogs, Reconstruction Within Canadian Systems, Persistent Dehumanizing Trauma Theory, Response Theory and Healing is the overall theme that threads through each section, and together all are connected to the Kelunson Healing V-Zone of Eagle at the top of the house post, which reveals pathways to recovery in response to anti-Indigenous racism in these systems that were not created for us. After experiencing assimilation tactics over and over again, my matriarchal response every time is, we're still here. In addition to being an expression of resistance, the embodiment of wisdom, and a tool for healing, Au, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House post also serves as a response to one of the many current challenges within academia: to indigenize our methodologies, to articulate our own research paradigms, our own approaches to research and our own data collection methods. Wilson, 2008, p. 54. My land-based work for my PhD emerged as an art form, and the Healing House post was created. While there are times I still fight being the tokenized, Noble v. Savage, I try to think of my reasons for pursuing my doctorate, which is to help create a better world for my children and grandchildren, for future generations of our community. With my family and people in mind, the description of my Indigenous framework includes one section written in Senkotan, R.W. Sinek dialect. Only those who can read Senkotan can benefit from these teachings. I do this purposefully because this part of the dissertation is written for my children, family and community. The Kelolmasen Orca Whale, Life Before Europeans, is based on teachings from elders' ways of knowing and being before European arrival. This section was gifted to me from Dr. Victor Underwood, who gathered these stories with W. Sinek Old Ones in the 1970s. He shares frequently that, these words come from my people and are for my people. Finally, I hope the results of this work will be made widely available to encourage other Indigenous nations and communities that wish to develop their own water, land, language and cultural connections and strategies for healing from systemic anti-Indigenous racism. More details and sources to come. His WKSI, IEM. V. Kelunson Eagle, Healing Vision. WEXES Frogs, Reconstruction Within Canadian Systems, Persistent Dehumanizing Trauma Theory, Response Theory. Spa at Bear, Janonet, To Give and Receive Acknowledgement. Kelolmasen Orca Whale, Life Before Europeans. Figure 1, Au, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House post. Ix. Table of Contents. Supervisory Committee, P. E. Abstract, P. IV Summary. Pages versus Table of Contents. P. Ix List of Figures. P. She Dedication. P. She Acknowledgements. P. XIV Chapter 1, W. Sinek ne Aleninek Self-Location. P. 1. 1.1. Au, Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post, Introduction. p. 7. 1.2. Dealing with Systemic Injustice, Another Kind of Educational Journey. p. 10. 1.3. The Reality of Assimilation. p. 15. 1.4. Being a Statistic. p. 18. 1.5. Language and Land, Land and Language. p. 19. Chapter 2. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen is Methodology Creating a W-SYNEC Theoretical Framework. p. 22. 2.1. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post Description and Purpose. Ellipsis 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 dot dot. p. 22. 2.2. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post Conceptual Framework Outline. p. 26. 2.3. Healing House Post Conceptual Framework. Ellipsis. p. 27. 2.4. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen. p. 27. 2.5. Methods. Pages 30x. 2.5.1. WSANEC na Leninek Self-Location. p. 30. 2.5.2. Storywork. p. 31. 2.5.3. Autoethnography, Telling My Story. p. 34. 2.5.4. Prayer and Ceremony. p. 42. 2.5.5. Kenala, et Sani Matriarchal Duties. p. 46. Chapter 3. Kelolmasen Orca Whale, Life Before Europeans. p. 53. Chapter 4. Spa et Bear, Janonet, To Give and Receive Acknowledgement. p. 70. Chapter 5. WEXES Frogs, Reconstruction Within Canadian Systems, Persistent Dehumanizing Trauma Theory Response Theory. p. 77. 5.1. Persistent Dehumanizing Trauma Theory Some Background. p. 79. 5.2. Speaking Truth to Power, A Confrontation with MCFD and the SPH. p. 83. 5.3. The Layered Trauma of Indigenous Specific Racism in Service Provision. p. 98. 5.4. The Unique Impacts of Systemic Racism on Indigenous Families. p. 99. 5.5. The Need for a New Theory. p. 101. 5.6. The Impacts of PDTT-R Theory on Service Provider Competencies and Indigenous Healing. p. 103. 5.7. Call to Action. p. 108. 5.8. Guidance for Indigenous Families. p. 109. 5.9. Guidance for the Health Care System. p. 110. 5.10. Hope for the Future. p. 113. Chapter 6. Kellenson Eagle, Healing Vision. p. 114. 6.1. Healing House Post Summary. p. 117. 6.2. Closing the Circle, Journeying Forward, Healing the Future. Pages 118. She. References. p. 124. She. List of figures. Figure 1. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post. p. v. Figure 2. Sartlip Day School, Personal Class Photos. p. 17. Figure 3. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post. p. 25. Figure 4. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post. p. 53. Figure 5. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post. p. 69. Figure 6. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post. p. 76. Figure 7. Sites of Harm and Healing Rocks. Ellipsis 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 dot dot. p. 108. Figure 8. Ow, Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post. p. 114. Figure 9. Basic Principles of W-SYNEC Law. p.121. She. Dedication. I dedicate this PhD to my late daddy who taught me how to be. He allowed me to think outside the box and stand up for myself. This work is also dedicated to my family who have been there for me through it all and are the reason I do what I do. I also dedicate this to all my ancestors who made it that we are still here. XIV. Acknowledgements. I would like to acknowledge my husband Romain Underwood for standing with me in all the battles I have had to endure. I acknowledge my 8 children, Joshua, Brett, Julia, Savannah, Ruth, Abigail, Romain Jr. and Victor for being who you are and gifts from the Creator, my mom for always helping me with my children and grandchildren, and my 11 grandchildren, Kaya, Lavina, Joshua Jr., Kenneth, Bryden, Alexander, Baptiste, Carter, Gabriel, Tyson and Ellen for bringing pride, joy and laughter to hard days. I would also like to in general thank all my family and friends who have been there for me. I feel very fortunate to have a great network that I do not want to leave anyone out. I am forever grateful for those the Creator allowed our paths to cross. 1. Chapter 1, Wisanik na Ilininek Self-Location. Eascastle, my name is Eskiselwet. I live on Stock First Nation, located in Wisanik Nation, Coast Salish Territory. I attended the University of Victoria for my undergraduate degree 2001 and MA 2010 both in the School of Child and Youth Care. I am married to Romain Underwood, and we have 3 children who still live at home, Abigail, Romain Jr., and Victor. I have 5 adult children who live on their own, Joshua, Brett, Julia, Savannah, and Ruth. From my 4 older children I have 11 grandchildren, Kaya, Lavina, Joshua, Kenneth, Bryden, Alexander, Baptiste, Carter, Gabriel, Tyson, and Ellen. On my daddy Alfred Wilson's side, I am from Wisanik, a descendant from his great-grandmother matriarch Zycott. I am part Scottish, as his maternal great-grandfather Peter Bartleman was from Scotland. Zycott had 5 children with Peter Bartleman, one of whom was my great-grandfather, Joseph Bartleman. Joseph married my great-grandmother Jeanfia Genevieve Nelson paternal, and from this I have Hawaiian heritage as she was half Hawaiian. Together they had 12 children, one being my grandmother Virginia Jo, née Bartleman. My great-great-grandmother Isabel Dick is Nuucha Nulth from Seshot which is beside Port Alberni. She married my great-great-grandfather Albert Wilson, and they had their son Ernest Wilson, who is my dad's father. My dad died from alcoholism a month before I turned 16 years old. He attended Cooper and Kamloops residential schools from ages 7 to 14. My mom Lavina Olson, née Johnny, lives in Wisanik. She grew up in Snunimutripalu, Nanaimo, with her father Norman Johnny I and her mom Louise, née Jo, who is from Kwamiikun within Cowichan tribes. My grandfather Norman's mother was Agnes Wise. She had 7 sisters and 2 brothers, and my family extends from Nanus to Songhees on her. 1. In order to avoid confusion between another family who were given the same last name, one branch of my family used the spelling, Johnny, and another used the spelling, Johnny. 2. Side of our family. My grandfather's father Matthijs Johnny II was from Shell Beach. He went to Cooper Island Residential School with his 2 brothers and cousin. When they left residential school, they were given 3 different last names, Johnny, Mitchell and Lewis. My grandmother's mother was named Annie Jo, née Pinuts. She married William Jo. My older brother Charles Johnny grew up with my mom's parents in Nanaimo. My younger brother Blaine Wilson and younger sister Genevieve Elliott, née Wilson, grew up with me in Wisanik. My parents took in 2 cousins, my dad's sister's sons, who grew up in our home and were raised as my brothers, Todd Wilson Duell and Brandon Wilson. I begin with locating myself. Within our Wisanik community, we learn to introduce ourselves, as well as explain who our families are, at a young age. As McGuire 2010 points out, the ability to say who you are is critical in generating meaningful and needed indigenous-based histories that can transform how we, as Aboriginal peoples, think about ourselves and our location within this place called Canada. p. 119. In our community, if you don't introduce who your family is, you will be asked about this by several people later. Where I landed is where I am meant to be. Wisanik is home. Our land holds me like a magnet, our language rings within my soul, our culture is always present to sustain me despite all that cultural genocide has tried to take away. After saying how I landed, grew up live in Wisanik, I acknowledge there were possibilities of growing up in Duncan, BC, Nanaimo, BC, Port Alberni, BC and Port Angeles, USA. My family's roots stem from Duncan, Nanaimo, and Port Alberni, Port Angeles is where my late dad logged for a living. I often think about what life would have been like if he 2. See previous footnote. 3. Had stayed in Port Angeles, Washington, USA, which he might have if he hadn't been threatened with losing his land in Wjope Sartlip First Nation. After my dad's dad died when my father was 7 years old, the government Indian agents took him and his siblings to Kuper Island Residential School. Their uncle, their late dad's brother, and his wife offered to take the children to live with them in Port Alberni, BC, but the Indian agent said that they could not stay with family and had to go to residential school. If the decision by the Indian agent had been a yes, my dad and his siblings could have lived with their uncle, and we might have landed in Port Alberni. I was born in Duncan, BC, where we have lots of family and friends. If the logging economy had been sustainable, we might have stayed there and grown up there. I landed in Wjope Sartlip First Nation when I was 5 years old, when my late dad was told by Wjope that if he didn't move home from Port Angeles, he would lose his inherent land willed to him by his mom's dad, his grandfather Joe Bartleman. Of course, as a child I had to be with my parents, but as time has gone on, each year I am grateful and feel fortunate to have landed in Wjope, my Leninaek homeland. It is hard to write about a very big family tree. In my description of my relations from my parents to my great-great-grandparents, I have named them specifically, but there are many siblings of my parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents that I could not name, as the list would be very long. There are also many stories that could be told, but again, they would take very long to tell. Many Indigenous scholars write about the importance of self-location and identifying your connection to the community. Archibald, 2008, Hart, 2010, McGuire, 2010, Wilson 2008. For this reason, my dissertation includes self-location as part of my Indigenous methodology. 4. The purpose of using W-Senek Leninaek self-location in this dissertation is to situate myself within my family, recognizing both our strengths and the colonial experiences we are healing from. The cultural genocide aimed at getting rid of us, specifically through the impacts of residential school, loss of language, loss of culture, and loss of land. Colonization has caused so much harm. Kathleen Absalon, 2005, writes, "The legacy of colonizing knowledge has created a disconnection of people from their traditional teachings, people, family, community, spiritual leaders, medicine people, land, and so on. The oppressive silencing of Aboriginal knowledge has perpetrated oppression and threatens the ultimate extinction of cultures whose epistemologies, philosophies, worldviews and theories have sustained both the earth and its inhabitants for centuries." p. 27. Here in our ancestral territories, the impact of colonization has been ongoing for the last 250 years. In the latter half of the 19th century, the invader James Cook III was one of the first WENITEM white people to dehumanize and oppress many indigenous communities. Initially, it was the Catholic Spanish explorer Admiral Quadra who laid claim to European control of trading rights and indigenous traditional territories on and around what is now known as Vancouver Island. Chief Maquina, 2024. Quadra did this acting under the authority of the Doctrine of Discovery, Indigenous Corporate Training, Inc., 2023, a papal bull dating back to 1492 that gave him power to take land that was perceived as inhabited by non-Christian savages. 4. 3. I use the lowercase here intentionally, to take the power away from his name as a purposeful gesture of taking back control over what he has done to indigenous peoples and the intergenerational impact of this on my family. Throughout this dissertation, the lowercase is used to disempower colonial institutions and individuals who have harmed indigenous peoples. Also, in turn, all relationships that are important to me are capitalized. 4. A papal bull is a type of public decree or charter issued by a pope of the Catholic Church. Since our people were supposedly not Christians, I use a small c, as an act of resistance. Quadra assumed that our lands were available for the taking since only savages were on our traditional territories. 5. Captain Cook, the first English explorer in our territories, encountered Mwachat Chief Joseph Maquina while charting the geography of the Pacific Northwest as a cartographer for the British Navy. He reported back to King George III of England, who granted more people like Captain George Vancouver, who had originally sailed as a midshipman with Cook, permission to travel the seas and to take land in what they called a New World. While Cook was among the first of many colonizers to dehumanize our people, Captain George Vancouver, who had served under him, competed with Spanish Admiral Quadra for rights to trade and settlement in negotiations with Mawachat chief Joseph Maquina. Eventually, the British-dominated European claims to the benefits of our traditional territories. Each time invaders arrived, they needed a place to settle, and those places were our spaces, our ancestral homelands. Throughout this ongoing land theft from the 19th century until the present, many circumstances in our lives and livelihoods got progressively worse. This caused the death of so many of our people. The sad part is that we are human. Question: what would have happened if these explorers approached our lands with a broader understanding of civilization and traditional ways of knowing and being, and really saw us as humans? I wonder if our histories and livelihoods would have been different. To address the harms of colonization, I am proposing a W. Au, Nanat Sextkeen Indigenous Healing Framework, grounded in our ancestors' wisdom and my own work as a matriarch, resulting in pathways and strategies to help W. heal from systemic harms. Our ancestors had to endure so much for us to still be here. In Decolonizing Methodologies, 3rd edition 2021, Linda Tuhiwai Smith writes, for many communities, there were waves of different sorts of Europeans, Dutch, Portuguese, British, French, whoever had political ascendancy over a region. And, in each place, after figures such as Columbus and Cook had long departed, there came a vast array of military personnel, imperial administrators, priests, explorers, missionaries, colonial officials, artists, entrepreneurs and settlers, who cut a devastating swath, and left a permanent wound, on the societies and communities who occupied the lands named and claimed under imperialism. p. 23. This permanent wound still exists through the systems we navigate in daily life, including the health care, education, children and family, and in justice systems, because these were established through colonial policies and procedures that don't normally account for indigenous ways of knowing and being. My overall research question is, how do Kenala, et Sani W. heal from systemic anti-indigenous racism? In response, I have developed a W. framework which I have named Au, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House Post. This is a framework for healing from the ongoing colonial experience we endure on Turtle Island, specifically through a WSANIC lens. Old One Victor Underwood gifted me with his research interviews with W. Old Ones in the 1970s. The stories of life before Europeans are the foundation of my framework and guided my PhD studies. With this framework I will describe some old ways of knowing that helped our people endure through the invasion of settlers. 5. I will explain how we are currently surviving and healing from the harm of indigenous-specific racism within institutional systems. I will also talk about how land, language and culture will triumph over the trauma and provide healing for future generations, explaining how Healing House Post will turn historical harms into recovery and regeneration. 5. I capitalize the term, settler, to denote the importance of this term as a land standpoint identifier. This term is connected to place for Canadians with non-Indigenous settler ancestry who come from somewhere else and occupy Indigenous land. 7. 1.1. Au, Nanat Sextkeen Healing House Post Introduction. My writing is connected to my place, embedded in my homeland of WSANIC, and interwoven with culture through my active use of our Senkotan language, the artwork and images on the post itself, and the stories and teachings connected to each section of the house post. I write for my children and grandchildren. They demonstrate resilience and revitalization on their educational journeys while discovering and recovering our ancestors' ways of healing. In turn, they will create their own strategies for recovery from the intergenerational impact of colonization. It has been said that it will take 7 generations to heal from the effects of residential schools. Since my dad went to residential school, I am a first-generation survivor. I did not have to go to residential school, but the school I attended was a day school run by the Roman Catholic Church. My children are second-generation survivors, and my grandchildren are third-generation survivors. On many levels, the intention of this residential and church-based school system cultural genocide has devastated our lives. Yet droplets of hope have surfaced through me as a mom to 8 children and the realization of my matriarchal duties within my community. I have seen and felt miracles that show why we are still here. What are we healing from? Sometimes I wonder if my children, as second-generation survivors, can really understand what their grandfather went through at residential school, when they didn't even get to meet him. I have told stories about him and shared the teachings that he gifted to us. My dad taught us all kinds of things, from the difference between right and wrong, to the traditional process from gaffing fish to smoking fish. He encouraged our speaking Senkoden by proudly recording us counting to 100. My dad trained us like boxers with push-ups, sit-ups, medicine ball exercises and workouts. He told us we needed to jog, and when we did, he would walk along with us at the same time. When we were in trouble, he would talk to us for 2 or 3 hours. He would celebrate our birthdays and Christmas, although after he passed we learned that he very highly likely did not get to enjoy these special occasions himself when he was in residential school. Personally, I did my best to heal from the damage to our family, even though I often felt I wasn't making any progress. Looking back, I now realize that I was merely surviving, but survival itself was a form of decolonization. At the time I did not know that many of my late dad's teachings were his way of decolonizing and resisting everything he endured during his approximately 7 years of having to live his school years at Kuper Island and Kamloops residential schools. My dad told a few stories of his experiences in these institutions, but they were very brief and mainly on the positive side, like how he learned to box and play basketball. The most negative experience he spoke of described physical punishment, being hit on the hand with a ruler by nuns. After he died, I knew that he did the best he could raising us. The teachings he gave us carried us a long way and helped us to heal with the assistance of all the family that he held close. In reflection, I realize he was not only mending his own connections with our ways after the serious effort these horrible schools made to rip his culture away from him, he was doing this for us, his children, as well. Karen Stott 2015 writes, "For over 100 years, Canada forcefully removed Aboriginal children from their communities and sent them to these church-run institutions. These schools were never intended to educate, but to separate Aboriginal children from their way of life and to indoctrinate them in European ways. These also aimed to Christianize Aboriginal children, to inculcate within them clear roles for men and women within a nuclear family, and to instruct them to become a subservient class of workers within the Canadian political economy." p. 34. 9. What my dad was able to work through after his experiences at residential school allowed us, as his children, to have a stronger cultural fabric in our lives. We still had much to mend ourselves, but we had the foundation that he created for us. This was our family decolonizing. It involved visceral, nitty-gritty stuff, yet we just did what was needed to survive and keep going. Because we had to. As my dad's oldest child, I feel like he gave me a large dose of resistance. He wanted me to be able to stand up for myself. He didn't allow us to do wrong, and physical discipline was often the consequence when we did. Clearly the behavioral pattern he learned through physical punishment in residential school stayed with him and was passed on to us. When I had my children, I thought this was the way to discipline them, but after spanking them, I had extreme guilt. I would always be saying sorry to my children, especially to my oldest. I read books, went to a parenting group, went to church, and talked to old ones, elders, and other parents. When I had 2 sons, I was still a raging physical disciplinarian as a parent. I would think to myself, I love them so much, why did I hurt them? I kept reading Dr. Mom, which was my go-to book. I also watched their dad in his fits of anger and remembered that his dad was also a victim of residential school. I then decided to try counseling. Counselors in 1993 were not ready to work on residential school issues. Counselors didn't really begin to do solid work in this area of trauma until after 2008, when the government thought that they should apologize for what was done to our children. I stopped spanking as a means of discipline after I had my 3rd child. It wasn't that I was healed, or that I knew better, or that I was the best parent in the world. I still made a lot of mistakes and was learning on my journey as a parent. This life learning continues to this day. Another intergenerational effect on my parenting was my memory of my father's inability to put his love for us into words. Even though I never really heard the words, "I love you, Tracy," 10. My dad would say, "I love you kids," about once a year, if that. The result was that I ended up doing the opposite. I always told my children I loved them every day, seeing them happy was my goal, but sometimes I overcompensated in expressing these feelings because I did not know balance. When we were young, we got one birthday present and one Christmas present, which was likely better than my dad's experience had been in residential school. By contrast, when I had my children, I went all out and overcompensated on special occasions. I decorated, invited family to celebrate, at one time hired a clown. There were never less than 4 to 5 presents, including one big one. Thinking of this overcompensation, again I'm forced to ask, so what are we healing from? Again, I am a first-generation residential school survivor, my children are second-generation survivors, and my grandchildren are third-generation survivors. My prayers are that each generation will have love, healing and protection from the effects of residential school and cultural genocide. Healing is the overall theme that ties each section together of my Nonat Sextkeen Healing House Post framework. It explores a concrete way in which I, as an Indigenous survivor, might respond to and heal from the historic injustices I endured. 1.2. Dealing with systemic injustice, another kind of educational journey. I think back to the beginning of my post-secondary educational journey while doing the 300-level courses of my undergrad in 1999. I was told that writing about Indigenous topics offered endless opportunities because there was not a lot of helpful research directly related to our Indigenous communities. It felt like the world was my oyster when it comes to research. I researched boys and depression. I had 2 young sons and 2 daughters at the time, and I was worried about one of my sons. Of course, I had to research boys and depression within mainstream settler society and then utilize these ways of knowing and being, then adjust this 11. Information by adapting it to an Indigenous context. At the time, I did not know that I was indigenizing current scholarship. I wanted to learn more and find ways to help my family and my people. In hindsight, I believe that I indigenized my research just by putting my hands on it and looking at it from my point of view. I also believe my educational journey arrived at the cusp of Indigenous research, at a time when I could explore what indigenization actually meant to me. Linda Tuhiwai Smith wrote her first book titled Decolonizing Methodologies in 1999, a seminal book on Indigenous research, and I first came across her work when I began my graduate studies in 2003. To decolonize, change and erase what is colonized, Tuhiwai Smith 1999 writes. It angers you when practices linked to the last century, and the centuries before that, are still employed to deny validity of Indigenous peoples' claim to existence, to land and territories, to the right of self-determination, to the survival of our languages and forms of cultural knowledge, to our natural resources and systems for living within our environments. p. 1. Her writing made me think of my elementary school years attending Sartlip Day School, which eventually transitioned to a self-determining tribal school in 1990. This process took many years, yet now we have a language immersion program and our first cohort of students from nursery are now in grade 11. They walk with strength due to language and culture. I think about how many generations have passed since our Indigenous education systems were intact, how many generations were punished for using their language and culture, and how many generations it will take to rebuild our strength in our language. I'm from the generation that didn't know the difference between attending a day school as opposed to a residential school. We simply went home at the end of the school day. I had both positive and negative experiences. On the 112 hand, I attended school with friends and family who looked like me. On the other hand, the goal was for us to be colonized and assimilated. I attended Sartlip Day School from kindergarten to grade 7. My late daddy attended residential school but did not talk much about it. He guided us through our elementary school years, and the main message to us children was that we needed to finish grade 12. I had 3 older cousins graduate before me, with about 8 other older cousins who should have finished before me. Graduating grade 12 was one of the first times I was an exception. Being a first-generation residential school survivor, I did not realize the significance of this at the time. Years later I looked at a class photograph of my kindergarten year. Out of approximately 25 of us, only 3 of us graduated when we were supposed to. 4 or 5 students finished a few years later. 5 others died young, and it saddened me. I saw this as a reflection of the mortality of my people and the effects of colonization. I didn't know about the low graduation rates of our people at the time. Now I think of Linda Tuhiwai Smith's 1999 words. In talking with people in the community, I became interested in the questions which they were asking of health which were not being addressed by research. We know we are dying, someone said, but tell me why we are living. Our health will not improve unless we address the fact that we have no sovereignty. We're sick of hearing what's wrong with us. Tell us something good for a change. Why do they always think by looking at us they will find the answers to our problems? Why don't they look at themselves? The same questions were being asked of education and justice. p. 198. These questions about the lack of indigenous sovereignty and self-determination in health, education and justice reflected my own lived experience.